Okay, I'm in Ephesians chapter 4. I'm going to be moving forward from verses 4, 5, and 6, moving into verse 7, finally, to deal with a whole different topic. Paul makes a transition and begins a new topic, and so we've got a lot to see here and a lot to say. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 7, he says, "But to each one of us grace was given according to the measure of Christ's gift." All right, that is the transition from verse 6, one God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in you all. And then verse 7, but, all right, but to each one of us was given. We have a new topic. All right, now I'm going to go from verse 7 into verse 12. But I'm not going to cover verses 8, 9, and 10. I won't be covering those. The main reason why is because there's not a lot of certainty that these passages, verse 8, 9, and 10, were in the text that Paul really wrote. There is there are some good arguments to say that these verses were kind of inserted in there from somebody else. And so because there's not a lot of confidence in terms of its legitimacy, I'm not going to cover it. In addition to that, it's kind of a deviation from the theme that is presented between verses 7 and 12. It's a deviation, and it's a significant one. And so I don't think that it really fits in here very well. So if you'd like to explore these verses, there are a lot of other people who have spent time talking about these. I don't remember for sure, but there's a good probability that I addressed these in the series that I did on spiritual warfare. And so I would encourage you to listen to those, because I think the theme that people are usually approaching or that they're thinking of would be more consistent with the messages that I produced on spiritual warfare. You can find those in the Living God Ministries radio archive. All right, I'll read these verses, 8, 9, and 10, just to give you a sense for this, where he says, "Therefore he says, when he ascended on high, he led captivity captive and gave gifts to men. Now this he ascended, what does it mean? But that he also first descended into the lower parts of the earth. He who descended is also the one who ascended far above all the heavens, that he might fill all things." Okay, so there can be some things with reference to the gifts, and also that he fills all things. In verse 10, that he might fill all things. There could be some relationship between verse 6 and 7 down to verse 12, but I just don't think that it's significant enough, and so I'm gonna skip those verses and not do so without telling you that why or why did I just ignore those, because there's all kinds of questions that people will think about that will come to the surface when dealing with these passages. All right, instead we have a new topic, and the fundamental topic that's presented here is the work of ministry. That's pretty much what Paul is bringing up, is that once you have been saved, once you have been born again, and you have been experiencing all that he has spoken of between chapters 1 and chapter 4, chapter 1, 2, and 3, after you get past all of that, then the next stage or transition that he wants people to consider, even more than they did before, is the topic of participating in the work of ministry. All right, that's what he's now going to get into. And so there, of course, is a lot that needs to be said about this. I'm going to spend some time talking about the struggles that ministries have and why. I'll spend some time talking about that. But before I get into that, let's review a little bit of what I said in the previous message with regards to the objectives of God, all right, the purpose of God and the objective of God. You really need to start there, and from there you'll be able to appreciate more what it means to deviate and to understand the deviations that a lot of people get into because they are not really paying attention to what God is really doing, what he's doing. Instead, they become a little bit more focused on what they are doing instead of what he is doing. Okay, so let's review what is God doing? I mean, what is he really doing? What are his objectives, right? And what are his purposes? He is a person, and what his objectives are really matter. What his purposes are really do matter. What he thinks, what he feels, those things matter. Those things are important. That's who he is as a person, what he's doing, what he's thinking, how he's feeling. We need to know, more about these things if we're going to get to know him as a person. And that is a purpose of God, that people may get to know him as a person, of course, because they want to. All right? And it turns out that if you don't want to, then you won't be confronted with too much, that will overwhelm you so that you feel like you have to. Okay? We have some examples when God has done what I like to call the God thing. The God thing is the lightning, fire, thunderous, powerful voice of God. He's done the God thing on a few occasions. The best example of this is with the children of Israel. I was referring to them in the previous message. The children of Israel, they were set free from Egypt, and they were taken by God to the mountain of God, all right, which is found in Saudi Arabia. And it was there that he did the God thing. You can read about this in Exodus, where he gave them the fire and the lightning and the smoke and the thunderous voice. Exodus chapter 20, he gives the first 10 commandments. They make it through 1 through 9, and they do okay. But as soon as he gave them the 10th one, they said, "That's enough. Thank you. If you got anything more to add, go talk to Moses, and we'll get it from him." They didn't make it past the commandment, "Do not covet." Okay, that was just too much for them. But it was there that he did the God thing, and in doing the God thing, all right, in presenting himself in a way that no one is going to be able to deny who he is, that still wasn't enough. Look, that entire generation did not make it into the promised land, all right, except for 2 people. That was the result of him doing the God thing. Obviously it didn't really help. It's not going to really help. We got a good example of what happened, that the people still didn't trust him. They still didn't really believe him. They still wouldn't rely on him. They still wouldn't do that. Even after he's done the God thing in the way that he did in multiple ways, it still wasn't enough. And so don't think that if God would just do the God thing, that people would then all, believe in him and trust him and stuff like that. No, we've got an example where it didn't work. Okay? It's only those people who really want to know who he is. Do you really want to know who he is? Then do you want to know what his objectives are? What are his purposes? What is he doing? Do you want to know? And do you want to know what he thinks and how he feels? Okay, these are the things that really matter. Because if you are going to be a participant in the ministry of God, then it's going to have to be connected to what his objectives are, what his purposes are. That's going to be important. You would think that people would know that, but in general, they don't think about that too much. They're thinking about other things. And that's unfortunate. God can make use of those things. I've seen him make use of these deviations, but the people who then get to know who he is usually have to leave the work of the ministry or the participation in the ministry that these people are involved in. And so, it's important to understand that if you don't know and understand the objectives and purposes of God, Yeah, he can still make use of you. I've seen him do it, but it's not going to be as effective as it would be otherwise. All right, so we need to keep in mind what the purposes and objectives are of God. Otherwise, what you end up with is you end up with the purposes and the objectives of people. Okay, and this is a real challenge, because a lot of people, they first get to know the Lord because they want to know what He's going to do for them, right? What's God going to do for me? I've got some objectives in life. I've got some goals. I've got some purposes. It could be those kinds of things that are fundamental to sustaining life, and we need some divine intervention because we're running out of options ourselves. If that works, if that gets a person started, then by all means, whatever it takes, it gets people started. But that's how people usually get started. They get started with this selfish attitude of, what is God going to do for me? I'll be a Christian. I'll be a part of whatever, because I have this conviction that He's going to do something for me, and it will be related to an individual's objectives and purposes. All right, what they think and how they feel. And I don't want to say that those things have no importance at all. I don't want to say they have no importance. What I will say is that in comparison with the purposes and objectives of God, they have no importance. Okay, but that doesn't mean that they have no importance entirely. But like I said, this can be a motivator to get people started. It works, it's fine, but eventually a person is going to be confronted with the fact that what their objectives and purposes are, and what they think and how they feel, all right, doesn't have as much relevance to God as they would like it to. Because there is a purpose that He has in mind. When He created this world, He did so with an objective, with a purpose. And if you're going to be a part of the work of ministry, it's going to have to be consistent with what He's doing. Otherwise, people tend to do their own things. Okay, and that happens a lot. When it comes to a church or any religious organization or ministry of any kind, okay, these things can easily be constructed and operated in a way that meets the objectives and the purposes of the leadership, the people who are running these organizations. It's related to the purposes and objectives of the people running these organizations, and that may not necessarily be consistent or too consistent with the objectives and purposes of God. All right, even though they may say it is, we exist so that people can be saved. Well, that's good, right? That's nice. We exist because we want to uplift the living God, because we want people to have a relationship with Him, and these things are good, but even though this may be something that is said, or advertised or written down, what is your purpose? So people will be saved. They will believe the gospel of Jesus Christ. That may not necessarily be the overwhelming majority of what they do. It just may not be that way. I'll tell you what the trap, okay, that's very, very hard to avoid. The trap is that these organizations, all right, a church or ministry or whatever, can easily become a business. All right, they can easily become a business and operate more like a business than a ministry. Okay, and when that happens, what is the fundamental objective of a business? It's to produce a profit, okay, a monetary profit. It's to have a certain amount of revenue. Okay, that's the objective of a business, so that the people who are working the business can obtain a paycheck, all right, so they can be paid for whatever it is that they're doing. That's a business. And when you have a non-profit, that is not, necessarily running for the purpose of generating a profit, okay, well, everyone who receives compensation for the work they are doing for the business, they individually are experiencing a profit. Okay, so the nonprofit really means, in most cases, that the business itself will not be retaining a profit or retaining earnings. Instead, it will be all spent on the objectives and purposes that the ministry or business was established for. But the people who are running it, they're going to get paid. They get a paycheck for that, and they're the ones individually who receive a profit. And because of that, there tends to be a bias towards running the organization in a way that will increase the profits, okay, increase the money, so that people can get paid more, or they can hire more people, to do various tasks, various work. So that's what happens. That's the trap, okay, that many religious organizations will fall into, is that they will begin to operate like a business more than a ministry. Okay, in fact, if you were to evaluate their tax returns, because every nonprofit has to file a tax return, file a statement that gives an accounting for what they received and how they used it. When you go through that, you can find that most of the money that these organizations are making are made from the sale of things, of books, of materials, CDs or audio files, whatever it is that they might be selling. They are selling tangible assets, okay, that people are purchasing. It's just a regular business of having something for sale that somebody buys, okay? And as long as no more than 2/3 of the ministry's revenue, as long as no more than 2/3 comes in from these sales, then the organization is still considered to be a nonprofit. All right? That's the fundamental rule. If 1/3 of the money that an organization receives is by donations, 1/3 and more, then the organization is still considered to be a nonprofit. So because 2/3 of the revenue, according to the way that the laws are set up, 2/3 of the revenue can come from sales. Well, that's the overwhelming majority of the money that is received by the organization is from sales. Of course, every organization operates differently. I'm just giving you just kind of the general perspective to understand how it's easy for a ministry to really function and operate like a business, okay, for the purpose of producing a profit, for the benefit of the people who are working the business. And they provide things for sale so that people will purchase them, and that becomes the majority of the work of the supposed ministry, which is really running like a business. When I set up Living God Ministries, I'm the founder of Living God Ministries, and when I set it up, I specifically wrote the charter in a way that the ministry would hopefully never go in the direction of becoming a business. And the fundamental rule is don't sell anything. Okay? And Living God Ministries doesn't sell anything. There's nothing for sale. And that is a way to avoid it becoming more like a business and to be run like a business. And at the time that I'm doing this recording, it's been functioning like this for 20 years, and has done very well. If we added the idea of selling stuff, it's possible that we could have maybe doubled or tripled, as long as we don't go over tripling, but up to tripling the amount of money that would be available to work with, and we would have been able to do a lot more. Okay, but that was the trade-off. Do less, but do less exclusively as a ministry instead of do more, which could be altered into a business, in which case there can be a lot of changes and consequences that may result from that. Okay, so that's the fundamental trap that people run into, and why it can be so easy to forget the purposes of God and the objectives of God because they're not as important as getting paid. Okay, that's what happens, and it's hard to avoid that. It just is. I've watched this happen a lot in my lifetime. I've watched it happen a lot. Okay, so let me go ahead and proceed into verse 12, and I'll come back to verse 7. Okay, but I'm going to proceed into verse 12 in order to give you a sense for what's going on. All right, in verse 12, this is Ephesians chapter 4, verse 12, for the equipping of the saints for the work of ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ. All right, and we need to stay focused on the idea of the work of ministry. I'm not going to get into too many details in this message. I don't have time for that, but in the next message I'll talk about this with more detail. I just want you to see that there is an interest in people being equipped for the work of ministry. But there is a huge difference between the work of ministry from a business point of view and the work of ministry from the point of view of what God's objectives are. Okay, there can be a significant difference. All right, so you have to define what is the work of ministry. It has to be defined. Okay, if the work of ministry is defined as we sell books and other materials, all right, you're talking about a business. That's not a ministry, even though it's selling ministerial kinds of stuff, and that can have a wonderful effect on people's lives. All right, God can make use of that. But I don't think that's what he was really thinking of when it came to the idea of the work of the ministry. The work of the ministry must be directly connected to the objectives of God. And the simple way to describe the objectives of God is to say that God wants people to know who he is. Okay, I think that's a reasonable way. People are to be equipped to help others know who he is. Again, people need to be equipped to help others know who he is. So how are they going to be equipped? They have to know who he is. All right? All right. If you don't know who he is, what are you going to tell people about him? What is going to be the ministry? All right? If you don't really know who he is, you don't know what he's doing and why, then what have you got to share? What have you got to say? So the equipping is related to people getting to know who he is. All right? That's a general overview. I'll come back to verse 11 and 12 more in the next message. Let's go back up to verse 7 in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 7. He says, "But to each one of us grace was given according to the measure of Christ's gift." All right, there's a lot, that needs to be said about this. I'm just going to give you an overview for right now. To each one of us, grace was given according to the measure of Christ's gift. Christ's gift, grace was given. Okay, the general summary of what he's talking about is, of course, the giving of himself. God has given himself to us. All right, Christ's gift is Christ. It's him. All right, that's the fundamental gift. That's what he has given. He has given himself to us that we might know who he is. And a wonderful place to start is to know his grace. All right, when you know that God is gracious, you know a little bit about who he is. How would you describe him? How would you testify of him? Who is this God? This is a God who is gracious. This is a God who is giving. This is a God who gives what? He gives himself. Okay? Through forgiveness, that's a way of understanding him giving himself to us. that he gives himself in a way that he does not hold our sins against us, and he is present in our lives. That's a start. And that's a big one. That's a hard start for people to even get started with. All right? But I want you to see that the work of God is to give himself to others. So we are to receive him, right? We are to know him as a gracious person, and that he gives his grace freely, that this is genuinely a gift that he has given to us so that we might grow to know more about who he is. And then if we're going to be a participant in this work that he is doing, then it's going to be related to us helping others to see his graciousness. All right? To see him as a gracious person who is offering himself to them, no longer holding their sins against them, but establishing a new foundation, a new relationship based on the gospel, so that they might be born again by the Spirit of God and enter into a relationship based on what God gives to us, not a relationship based on what we think we're going to give to him. All right? Which is partially where a lot of businesses end up going. What are you going to give to God? Well, God doesn't need what you might think, okay? Or what people would like others to think. He wants you, all right? He doesn't need your money. He wants you. That's what he wants. And so, you are giving yourself to him in response to him giving himself to you. Okay? Again, in verse 7, but to each one of us grace was given according to the measure of Christ's gift. Well, what is this measure? It's all of it. Okay, what's the difference between people getting in touch with all that he has given versus others who apparently have received a lesser measure, okay, or a lesser amount? It all depends on you. It doesn't depend on Christ. It doesn't depend on our God. It depends on you. The measure of what he has given is the measure of which you have been able to receive, what you have been willing to receive. Okay, and there can be challenges to that because there are a lot of things that people believe that are not true that get in the way of people receiving the grace of God for themselves. It has to do with what people believe that is not true, that gets in the way of receiving the full measure of what he has given. So what usually happens is that people will receive some, a little. And then you come back and revisit these topics a little bit later, and maybe you can receive a little bit more, and then a little bit more. But it doesn't mean that he didn't give it to you. It just means you haven't received it. You haven't embraced it because you're believing a lot of other things that get in the way, that contradict the reality of what he really does think and what he's really given. All right, but to each one of us grace was given according to the measure of Christ's gift, and that's the full thing. All right, there's a full package. It's your God as a person. He's given himself to you. The obstacles have to do with us and to what degree are we able and willing to receive what he is offering. Okay, going to verse 11, and he himself gave some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, and some pastors and teachers. Okay, there's a lot to say about this, and I'll come back to verse 11. But what I want to give you is kind of an overview, just a summary, to say that this is going to be the response to what he gives to us in terms of himself. Okay, he gives himself to us, and then we have something to give to others. And the way that we give to others what he gives to us will be described as being one of these, perhaps an apostle, or as a prophet, or as an evangelist, or as a pastor, or as a teacher. This is not all, but it's a start, that these are the different ways that you may present who he is to you, to others, so that they might get to know who he is and have a personal relationship with him, not with us. With us is okay, but that's not the real primary objective. Is that others? The objective is that others may know who he is more than us. It's about to what degree do these people know who he is. So if you want to see, the effectiveness of a ministry, go and check with the people who are participating in the ministry and ask the question, to what degree do the people know more about who their God is? For real, and to what degree they may know who he is, that will give you a description of the effectiveness of that organization, of that ministry. Verse 12, for the equipping of the saints, for the work of ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ. Okay, so this is what I want you to get in touch with, is that God has given himself to us so that we might know who he is. That's his work. That's the ministry. Okay, and he has given us an opportunity to be participants in the work of ministry, which would have to be related to other people getting to know who he is through our testimony, through testifying of the God who we know, that others may get to know him and have their personal relationship with him. Okay, so this is just a summary and overview. I'll get into more details in the next message. For those of you who are using this for your small groups, I got a general question that could facilitate some conversation. What did you first want God to do for you? All right, you might reminisce or think about when you first decided to turn to him and embrace who he really is. What did you want him to do for you? All right, what were your objectives that you wanted him to fulfill? What were your purposes that you wanted him to fulfill? Why did you want him in your life? Okay, and I think it's worth thinking about and talking about, and so that you can see how you may have changed. All right, maybe you have. I would hope that you have, because usually the reasons why people turn to God are not very good reasons in comparison with what he has an interest in, and that our reasons for continuing to participate in his life in some way would be more compatible with his objectives and his purposes. So when you first came to know him, what did you want him to do for you? Okay, but now that you have gotten to know him more, how has that changed? How has that changed? And I'll continue in the next message. Thanks.